Virtually all things in life change. Nothing remains static, and this remains particularly true of language, with English being no exception. What you see and hear in the current year is not the way Shakespeare spoke, nor Chaucer, nor the bards of the Anglo-Saxons. In fact, most speakers of English, whether native or non-native, would be shocked to bear witness to the changes that have taken place within the English language over countless centuries. To find all this out, get ready to learn what happened to English. The origins of English go back over 1,500 years ago to continental Europe, and to understand the history of the English language is to understand the history of early medieval politics and the state of the world in post-Roman Europe. As Rome was falling apart and became barely recognizable as an empire, the imperial powers of Rome deemed it necessary to abandon Britain in the 4th century AD. This led to a tribal power vacuum throughout the island that would later bring about the circumstances for the presence of English in Britain. Fast forward approximately a century later to 449 AD, and the Celtic war leader Vortigern, increasingly put under pressure by the northern Pictish tribes of Scotland, feels compelled to send a desperate invitation over to continental Germanic tribesmen, led by the legendary brothers Hengist and Horsa, the stallion and horse in modern English, to help the beleaguered Celtic tribes fend off the savage attacks of the Picts, as the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were warriors and mercenaries of great renown, such that their prowess was even known in distant lands. In exchange, the Germanic tribesmen were promised a stretch of land of their own. Predictably, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes defeated the Picts, and Vortigern, true to his word, granted them the land of Linsby in Northumbria. But Hengist and Horsa, seeing and recognizing the weakness of both Vortigern and the Britons, betrayed their former employer and invited over other Germanic tribesmen from the continent and began a campaign of destruction, conquest, and displacement that would last centuries. These military and political actions created the seeds and beginnings of the English language as we know it. With the Celtic Britons pushed far north into Scotland and Wales, respectively, English kingdoms take root, and the language begins to take on a life of its own. As with many cultures in the world, the Anglo-Saxon literary tradition began as an oral one, and the first written document we have in English language is a law code issued by one Ethelbert of Kent in the early 600s AD. And the earliest written literary document was a religious text called Cædmon's Hymn. But far and away, the most famous piece of Old English literature has always been Beowulf, an epic poem which tells the tale of Beowulf, a hero and warrior of the Geats, who comes to the aid of Hrothgar, king of the Danes, as his land is besieged by the hideous monster Grendel, whom Beowulf ultimately defeats and slays with his own hands. However, Old English is barely recognizable to a modern speaker of English, as the following passage, taken from the beginning of Beowulf, shows. Hwat we gardena in year dagum, theod kuniga thrym jefrunon, huthath ethlingas eden fremedon, oft schild scheffing, sheathena threatum, monegum, megthum, meodo setla, ofteach, edgesode eolas, sithan ares werth, fjasheft funden, hethas frofre jabad, weox under wulknum, weoth mindem tha, othetim edgewilch, thara im sitenra, overhronrade, hiran skolde gomban yildan, that was god kuning, which translates to modern English as, low praise of the prowess of people kings, of spear-armed Danes, in days long sped, we have heard, and what honors the nobles won. Oft shilled the scheffing from squadron foes, from many a tribe the mead bench tore, awing the earls, since erst he lay friendless, a foundling, a fate repaid him, for he waxed under the sky, in wealth he throve, till before him the folk, both far and near, who housed by the whale path, heard his mandate, gave him gifts. A good king he was. Some words are understandable from the Old English, such as kuning or king, or weox or waxed. But others have been lost to time or become completely obscure, such as wolknum, which exists in modern English as welkin, as sky, but is hardly known, or a word such as thrym, meaning might or splendor, which has completely disappeared from modern English vocabulary. Furthermore, if you look at the individual words in the Old English, you can see endings attached to them that no longer exist, such as dagum, which is called a dative plural, which indicates a certain grammatical designation required to understand the positioning and place of the word. These things have been lost in modern English. Old English was a fairly complex and detailed language in terms of grammar, and its root vocabulary was almost entirely Germanic. But, as with all things, this changed in time. One of the first big changes to take place was the introduction of Old Norse words to Old English, which took place after a series of Viking raids in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, which eventually led to Scandinavian settlements in England. The interesting thing about the interactions between the Old English and Early Norse was the degree of similarity between the languages. Some examples of this are the following. Old English, that melede min modor, and that me skolde chiapian, versus Old Norse, that melti min mothir, at mer skildi kaupa, meaning in modern English, thus counseled my mother, and for me they should purchase. This meant that there was almost certainly a high degree of mutual intelligibility between the languages, but it was not at 100%, perhaps somewhere between 70 and 80%. This led to a situation where the fine details and meanings were at times lost, but also a great rate of borrowings into English from Old Norse. Everyday common modern English words ultimately derived from Old Norse are take, sky, leg, they, egg, and skill. To this day, many of our most common words are taken from the Vikings. Moreover, the high degree of mutual understanding between the languages, but lack of 100% understanding, led to the pitfall of endings being dropped off of words, which led to a more simplified, more recognizable form of English that is more reminiscent of modern English. Not too long after this, another great and impactful historical event took place, which was the Norman Conquest of England in 1066. William the Conqueror, himself a descendant of Vikings, set out to take England, and in a decisive moment at the famed Battle of Hastings in 1066, he did so. The details of his military campaigns are documented in a beautiful and well-preserved combination of writing and art called the Bayeux Tapestry, which chronicles the events of the Norman Conquest of England on embroidered cloth through Latin letters and medieval imagery. The consequence of this conquest was such that, more than anything else in the history of the English language, this military occurrence forever changed the way English would be perceived and spoken. In the subsequent centuries, English took on hundreds, if not thousands, of French loanwords that at times completely replaced the original English word, or often came to exist side by side with an English word, whereby the English word took on new meaning to accommodate the newer French word. For example, the Old English word aethel meant noble, but was replaced by the word, you guessed it, noble. Examples of strange sibling pair words exist, such as pig and pork, the former being the animal, the latter being the thing that ends up on your dinner plate, or cow and beef in a similar fashion, because English was the language of low peasantry, and French the language of nobility. The English farmer kept the name for the animal he reared and ate. The French aristocrat merely called it what he saw at the dinner table. This fundamental change in English lexical content, which refers to vocabulary, created an English that almost seems Romance in nature. But the truth is that despite the huge majority of English vocabulary being Romance in origin, the bulk and battery of English words, everyday words that is, remains doggedly and staunchly English. English from this period onwards is called Middle English. A famous example of this would be the opening lines of the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, who at times is called the father of English literature, which sounds as follows. Whan that April with his shures sote, the drocht of March hath pierced to the rote, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the flour. Whan Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath inspired hath in every holt and hath tender cropes in younger zonne, hath in the ram his halve koers irone, and smalle fowles maken melodie, that slepen all the nicht with open ye. So pricketh hem nature in hier courages, than a longen folk to goon pilgrimages, and palmeres for to seken strange strondes to ferne hollows coe in sundry Londres, which in modern English would be rendered as, when that April with his showers sweet, the drought of March has pierced root deep, and bathed each vein with sweet liquor, of such power that engendered from it is the flower. When Zephyrus too with his gentle strife to every field and wood has brought new life in tender shoots, and the youthful sun half his course through the ram has run, and little birds are making melody, who all the night with open eye do sleep, nature their hearts in every way so pricks, then people long to go on pilgrimages, and palmers who seek out foreign strands to far-off shrines, renowned in sundry lands. As anyone who can tell, this text, which is a little over 600 years old, resembles English far more than anything prior to it, but there are differences in meaning, and above all, in pronunciation. For the longest time, English had what are called continental values for how things were pronounced, meaning that, generally speaking, what you saw was what you got. But beginning in the early 15th century, things began to change. This is what we call the Great Vowel Shift. The Great Vowel Shift was a gradual shift in the manner and way in which major vowels in the English language were spoken and pronounced. By the 18th century, most, if not all of these changes had been solidified. However, the keen observer will note that many of these changes were still underway during the time of William Shakespeare, often considered the greatest English writer of all time. In fact, many of Shakespeare's sentences and rhymes make no sense in modern English because of the great differences in pronunciation. Take this famous sonnet by Shakespeare, for example. It does not make any rhyming sense in either modern British or American English, but it did in Shakespeare's time, because it was pronounced in a different way. From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die, but as the riper should by time decease, his tender hair might bear his memory. For Shakespeare and his listeners, these lines rhymed, but time marched on, and in standard varieties of English in the current year, they do not rhyme. A final, large change took place in English that was exclusive to England, and occurred after England had colonized America, and that led to large differences in pronunciation between standard American English and received pronunciation, or standard British English. These changes began in the 18th century and ended and were completed in the late 19th century. Differences in the pronunciation of such words as God, thought, and work, and others all arise from this period. Today, there are uncountable variants of English, and the language continues to change, but the chaos of the World Wide Web has added new elements of unpredictability to the equation. It might be impossible for our descendants to actually know just how it is we speak these days, because never before have things changed and shifted so rapidly through the unbound power of the internet. For more top lists just like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And don't forget to check out our other lists. And thanks for watching, and thanks for learning.